Presentations are starting, so we're going to get started on this workshop. So welcome to our workshop. Our workshop is titled Diversity of Ethnicity. What we're going to focus on is the key fact that being Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a race. And because it's an ethnicity, there's other elements of diversity that many other groups don't have. So why is it important to realize the diversity of the Hispanic ethnicity? It's because Hispanics are the largest growing minority in the United States. According to the Kaiser Foundation, 16.5% of the current U.S. population is composed of Hispanics. Now the thing is, the way you identify as a Hispanic, when you think of the stereotypical Hispanic, you might have a different picture pop into your head. Depending on what kind of Hispanic you are, you think of yourself. There are all sorts of Hispanics that make up the ethnicity of Hispanic. And as we see, Hispanics are growing astronomically. From 2000 to 2010, they grew by 53%. That grew from 35.3 million to 50.5 million. This growth is the largest growth among minorities. And we see that by 2050, Hispanics are actually expected to triple to the point where every out of 10 Americans, 3 will be Hispanic. So showing you, like, currently, this is the graph. You see majority is white non-Hispanics at 64%. Ever since like the 1960s, the percentage of white non-Hispanics has been diminishing. And you see minorities, and particularly Hispanics, are filling up a large chunk of that space. And the reason why this is happening is because Hispanics are coming here via immigration. They're coming here by just the fact that Hispanics actually give birth to more children than white non-Hispanics generally. So if you look at 2050, let's look at the projections. Because of this growth in immigrants and minorities, by 2050, the United States will no longer be a country of a single majority. Instead, it will be a country of minorities, with white non-Hispanics being the largest one. After that, you see Hispanics are now at 28.3%, roughly 3 in 10. That's amazing because you see the dynamic of what it means to be a typical American is going to change. And looking at this percent, this 30%, we need to see what kind of people make that up. Because it's not the typical of what you think of a Hispanic. So when it comes to understanding an ethnicity and a race, when you look at ethnicity, the definition of ethnicity is the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. That's important. You see, culture is not race-driven. Instead, it's race-independent. And you see race is a group or set of people or things with a common feature or features. That's just showing race is more superficial. If you look at someone and you see they're Caucasian, you see they're African American, you see they're Asian, those are all races. And ethnicity is race independent. You could see an Asian who's Hispanic. You could also see an African American who's Hispanic. The words are independent. So just a representation, if you look at Caucasians in the United States, generally it's race than ethnicity. You look at, you have Caucasians, you have Germans, French, English, Italians, Russians, Greeks. All superficially look alike. They have their minor differences, but you don't see that great of a difference. In the United States, you'll see if you ask the typical American who's white, what are you? They'll give you, oh, I'm 25% this, 25% that. That's because you see it's very superficial when you look at it. It's race, and you don't see the differences in terms of German, French, and all that. It's very hard. But when you look at Hispanics, it's opposite. Instead of race being on top and ethnicity being below, ethnicity is on top and race is below. And this is according to the census. You see, this is all the categories of race you could have checked off. There's a key difference, though. The census asks you, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? That's a separate question. And you see people are able to identify as Hispanic and then as a certain race. So you see there are Native Americans who are Hispanic, there are white people who are Hispanic, Asians, Native Hawaiians, African Americans, Pacific Islanders, mixed, and Alaska Natives. So many potentials of different kinds of Hispanics. So the main point of this is to explore the uniqueness of being an ethnicity. And what we're going to talk about are 3 main things that make being a Hispanic an extremely unique ethnicity and an extremely unique dynamic of American society. You see, racially, Hispanics are very diverse. Intermarriage is also bringing more diversity into the Hispanic ethnicity, and also the mixing of people. And in order to show these 3 points today, we have Jaylen Smith, who's a black Puerto Rican, and he's going to be presenting on race. and how race is independent of ethnicity, and he's going to show you in society how that's prevalent. I'm going to represent intermarriage. I'm white, but at the same time, I'm Hispanic. My dad's white, my mom's Hispanic. So you see, by intermarriage, I consider myself Hispanic. And then you're going to have Arturo and Jesse are going to explain the mixings of different people in terms of Hispanics in American culture and just the different amounts of Hispanics from different countries themselves and how they come to the United States and form a new little culture within that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jaylen, and he's going to explain a little bit more about race.
Okay, so yeah, I know I look black, but I promise I'm Puerto Rican. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about race within, the definition of Hispanic ethnicity and whatnot. All right. Okay. The topic of race in Hispanic American culture is highly essential to our uniqueness. Reason being is because our race is part of who we are. We may be of Hispanic ethnicity, but our race is more specific to the particular person that we are. So on that note, what does being Hispanic mean for me or for you? Being a Hispanic means that you have some relationship to Spain and or Spanish culture. But keep in mind that being Hispanic does not define your race, just your ethnicity, your culture. But through colonization and assimilation to the New World, the Spanish cultures, within the Spanish culture, new races, new mixes of races have come into fruition, such as mestizo, which are a fusion of European and the new Spanish culture, or mulatto, which is a mixture of European, Native American, and blacks or African Americans. Taking a look at it, mestizo, predominantly European and Native American. Mulatto, predominantly European, African American, Native American. Okay. So we're going to take a look at this graph. And you're going to see the racial diversity within the different countries of Latin America. You'll see that in countries such as Mexico and Honduras, there's actually the majority of the population is mestizo. You will look and see that Mexico 60%, Honduras 90%. They're a very diverse race, so of course there's going to be a lot of people. But in different countries such as Cuba or Puerto Rico, you see the predominant race of Hispanics are actually white in Cuba and Puerto Rico. But then you can take a look at the Dominican Republic, and it's a mixture of mestizo and mulatto, and so on and so forth. We'll go on, same thing, Colombia, 58% of the Hispanic population there is mestizo. But then we go over to Uruguay and Argentina. Well, again, the majority of the population is white. So you can see most of the populations on these graphs are mostly, well, except Bolivia, but most of the populations on these graphs are either white or mestizo, and mestizo is part white. In Bolivia, 85% of the population of Hispanics there are native indigenous people. That's the people that are started in that country. Also taking a look at Spain over here, the actual population is actually pretty much all white, like 99.999%. And these the Catalan and stuff like that. These are different cultures within Spain. But moving on, you'll see that these different countries, they come together, and there are different groups all within these countries. But yeah, moving on to our multiracial ethnicity in the U.S. U.S. Hispanics are a vastly diverse ethnicity, just like the different nations that make up Latin America. In the U.S., of the Hispanic ethnicity, 53% of people are actually white, meaning that they have the same type of European lineage or heritage, or some type of European heritage. But then we'll take a look at this graph, and 36.7% of the U.S. Hispanic population are mestizo and mulatto. 6% are 2 or more races and/or mixed, and then you see Native Hawaiians. Those are the lower minority portions. But with this, you think about where our ancestors hailed from, or rather our common ancestors. Common ancestry usually is used to define what race you are, but if you trace back to further roots, would you still consider yourself that particular race? What I mean by that is, let's say if your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had a husband that was Indian, but that was the only Indian that had ever been part of your family. Would the Indian keep breaking down and over in lower percentages until you didn't consider yourself part Indian anymore? Or would you still consider, or if not at that point, then what would you consider it broken down when you wouldn't technically consider yourself Indian anymore? Who here could say that they were racially white? There's not a lot of white people in Indianapolis. Okay, but everyone here is definitely Hispanic, I'm guessing, except James. but okay. These are the questions me, gentlemen like me and my colleagues here ask each other every day. But moving on, we know Caucasians today as there are different ethnicities, such as Irish, Italian, like as Brandon was discussing. But they actually hail from a different ethnicity than the Anglo-Saxons that came before them, the Vikings and stuff. Yeah, they were real. And the Anglo-Saxons, they all hailed from Scandinavia and northern European areas, such as those. They differ in various religions, society styles, and even languages. In society today, we'll see that in modern day times, Hispanics are involved quite heavily in American society. What I mean by that is, typically in TV shows such as Family Guy, American Dad, you see the Hispanic, and he's gardening or the pool boy, or but there are actually quite a few Hispanics in high white-collar positions in society today. They contribute a lot to more of the higher working class companies such as Apple or Google and whatnot. Hispanics have assimilated into the population of society, and to this day it's trickled down to society's working class. You get what I'm saying? But keep in mind that the typical, stereotypical Hispanic does not have to look like what we are, except me. But now that you learned a little bit about racial diversity, we're going to play a little game seeing if you can identify different U.S. citizens and whether or not they're Hispanic. All right. Carmelo Anthony. I'm sure you're all familiar with his NBA star. Say no?
No.
He said Hispanic.
Carmelo Anthony? Any other guesses? No. Actually is.
What?
Yeah, Carmelo Anthony is Puerto Rican. He was born to a Puerto Rican father and mother. Born and raised in the U.S.
Oh.
Okay. What about Mariah Carey?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Everybody got it right. Yes, Mariah Carey. She is actually of Venezuelan descent, or Venezuelan and African American descent. What about Tony Romo?
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. His last name.
He's so white, though. It could be an Italian last name. Well, yes, he is. He is Hispanic. He's a Mexican American. Moving on, Snooki.
No.
No.
I hope not.
I hope not.
5 foot.
Yes, she is.
What?
Snooki actually is she's actually of Chilean descent. She was born in Santiago and adopted by her Italian American parents at 6 months years old. What about Charlie Sheen?
Yes.
No.
Yes. gonna say yes, unfortunately.
Yes.
I feel like there's a lot of yeses.
Yes.
Charlie Sheen actually is in fact Hispanic.
What?
His birth name is Carlos Irwin Estevez. He changed it to Charlie Sheen after his father. It's his stage name. He actually has a brother by the name of Emilio Estevez. He's actually another famous actor.
The Mighty Ducks.
Right.
Yeah.
He was in the movie The Mighty Ducks.
Yeah.
What about Nicole Richie?
Yes.
Yes.
I
No.
wanna say yes.
Yep, she is.
What?
She's
Lionel.
Well, yeah, that's the point. That's how diverse this culture. Well, this next one might not be. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Nicole Richie, her birth name is actually Nicole Escobedo. Her birth father is of Mexican and African American heritage. She was adopted by Lionel Richie and Verna Hart. What about Kid Cudi?
Nah. No way.
Okay. Kid Cudi actually is Hispanic. If you think I'm lying, you can go on Google and check this out.
Don't go on Wikipedia.
I'm serious. Yes, the U.S. rapper Kid Cudi is Mexican through his father's side of the family. But now that we've learned a little bit about race, I'm gonna pass it over to Brandon here. He's gonna talk about intermarriage within the Hispanic culture.
Okay, so I hope you guys learn about racial diversity when you look at Hispanics, and you see that even Kid Cudi is a Hispanic. So you see the typical Hispanic that you have in your mind really isn't the most typical. That's just one group of a very broad diversity. So now we're going to talk about intermarriage. And as I said, I'm a product of intermarriage with a mother who's Hispanic, Honduran, and a father who's white. So the importance of intermarriage is the effect that it has is it's the mixing of people. You see different cultures are being united, and the thing about Hispanic intermarrying is it's inter-ethnic because Hispanic's not a race, but a lot of the times it can include an interracial element to it. Because as you just saw, if Kid Cudi would marry Kim Kardashian, that would be an inter-ethnic and interracial marriage. But sadly, Kanye beat him to it, right? So what we see is that as the world becomes more interconnected and global, more intermarriages are happening. You see people through Facebook, eHarmony, people are getting out there and you see cultures are colliding. And what's happening is intermarriage. And what happens is you see different cultures coming together, and sometimes you see new things emerge. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So looking at the views of intermarriage, globally, different people in different countries react differently to intermarriage. Some are more accepting and others are not. And you look in the Hispanic world, intermarriage has actually brought an entirely new chapter in race, which we're going to talk about, and that's mestizos and mulattos. When Spanish colonization happened, you saw white Spaniards would come and they'd marry native wives. What would happen is you have a mixed child. This child's not black or white, as simple as that. They're a gray area. In Hispanic culture, you saw an interesting response to that. Instead of identifying you're either this or you're that middle ground emerged. And that was the mestizo population. And so this is, I know Jaylen talked about it, but I'm going to go over it again. And sadly, a little bit got clipped off. But mestizo, if you look at mestizo, it's predominantly European and native. So it could be, if you're in Mexico, it could be a Spaniard and Aztec. If you're in Central America, Spaniard and a Mayan. You're in South America, it could be Spaniard and Incan. You see just how diverse it gets. And look at mulatto, you see it's predominantly European African American or African American and Native American. For example, in Honduras, we actually do have a thriving population of African American Hispanics. They're called Garifuanos. They live on the north coast, and it's very unique. You see that racial harmony existing between, white Hispanic or mestizo Hondurans and black Hondurans. So looking at mestizos, we're going to look a little bit more in depth. It's a gray area, so let's explore it a little bit more. There was a study done by the PLS Genetics Lab, and they were working with the Human Genome Project that looked at your DNA. They looked at populations of mestizos in 4 areas, in Colombia and Costa Rica, Mexico, and Argentina. All of them identify as mestizos, but the racial composition of them varied. If you look in Colombia, they found out of these 4, they had the most European in them. They had native and they had African in them too. Now the interesting thing is when you look at native, that can be different. There's different native tribes in different countries. So you see there's even another element of racial diversity in there. So you see after Colombia, you go to Costa Rica. Same title, they're all mestizos, but there's a different racial breakdown in there between Europeans and Native Americans. Go to Mexico, you see there's more Native American in there. You go to Argentina, there's a huge chunk of Native American in there. So you see mestizo is a gray area. And what's happened is very unique. Instead of saying you're either this or that, in a very unequal way, a new emergence has happened, this racial gray area that's devised a new culture that, as Jaylen showed you, all over Latin America, you see whites, you see African Americans, you see mestizos. So you see a beautiful mix that's emerged in the Hispanic community. Now, when we go to the United States, our history on intermarriage can be actually bleak. If you look at the times of slavery, in the United States we had anti-miscegenation laws. Sorry, that's a mouthful right there. And what you saw was, it was basically looking at African Americans and whites. They did not want to mix. So what happened was that was against the law, and you could be punished. So you did not see that sort of equality in marriage. Now, amazingly, Hispanics came late to the party in the United States. They were here, but they were never a huge driving force until later, when the United States went into California and they annexed that. So you see, Hispanics are largely unmentioned by those laws. What happened was, as the settlers came, they intermarried. So you see Americans intermarrying with Hispanics, but when the United States completely controlled all of California, all of Arizona, they didn't really marry to get involved. Instead, you see afterwards, in the times of segregation and all that, you see Hispanics basically follow suit with other oppressed minorities. It wasn't societally normal for a Hispanic woman to marry a Caucasian man. It wasn't. And you see society set those restrictions on following those laws. And so because of that, it was a silent societal rule. You didn't see that mixing happening. But as racial equalities happened in the United States, the civil rights movement came, Jim Crow laws were taken down. You see these laws were thrown down, they were overturned. And you see now, society's changing too. Generations that had previously been completely against intermarrying are now changing with younger generations that are more accepting to it. And what happened is now, 1 in 7 of newly married couples are actually interethnic or interracial. And that's an amazing thing. From the times of the 1960s, when you had segregation, to now, it's a dramatic change. And you see the mixing of different peoples has resulted in a new sort of thing. Now, let's look a little bit more into intermarriage in the United States. The largest group that's driving intermarriage is Hispanic and whites when they come and intermarry. And because of that, you see there's this gray area that's dividing too. Societally, we've been your one or the other. But you see offsprings of Hispanic and white children like myself. So it puts me in an awkward spot. What am I? Can I say I'm Hispanic? Can I say I'm white? Some people say you're not Hispanic enough. Some people say you're not white enough. Well, actually not that much for me because I look pretty white. But you see that's a difference. And if you look in the United States, when we look at intermarriages among Hispanics, it's mixing cultures and races at times. If you look at Hispanics actually have one of the highest trends of intermarriages. 1 in 4 newly married Hispanic couples since the 1980s, all the way to 2010, there's been a constant stream where 25% of newly married Hispanics have been married outside of the Hispanic race. I don't know, do any of you guys have family members who aren't Hispanic? Your parents have married out, or you have family members? Okay, so you see that's actually a common thing with 25%. And that's led to a gray area with that again. So when we look at Hispanics, majority of Hispanics, as I said, are marrying whites. Hispanic men and women both have an equal chance of marrying out. So it's not more likely that a guy is going to do it or a girl. You see, it's pretty equal. And because of that, as I said, this gray area is divided. And you see there is an impact with intermarriage between Hispanics and whites. When we look at that, we see that Hispanics marrying out of their ethnicity, they assimilate faster. Not only that, but it's helping bridge the gap between whites and Hispanics in terms of in terms of economic income, and even social gaps. So you see intermarriage is a form of assimilation. And this is just natural. Every wave of immigrants that's come here has faced this. You look at Catholics or the Irish. When they came here, there was backlash against them. But now, you see Catholics have assimilated in the culture through intermarrying and things like that. You learn a lot about your spouse. When you marry someone, you learn about their culture, you understand them more. And that's just a sign of the unique melting pot the United States is. And Hispanics are a really recent besides African Americans who were brought here in bondage, new element to this. One of the first times that you see a different racial group that's assimilating in, just like we had Irish and all that. So looking at the effects on intermarriage, according to the Ohio State Institute of Population Research, it's having a positive effect for the most part, just how it has in past generations too. So when the children of these marriages come out, you see that it's not that gray area. In Latin America, you do have a gray area. You can be both cultures, and its own race is divided. The United States is not the same. Sadly, the racial precedents of the past still follow. Nowadays, if you have a multiracial child, they're normally forced to, you're either this or that. That stems from a one-drop rule that was set up during slavery times and after the Civil War was set up. And it looked at African American children and white children. If there's a marriage, you had a multiracial child. That child was African American. Their white side was not accepted. And the one-drop rule stated if you have one drop of African American blood, you were considered completely African American. 1/32 is all it took. You could have everyone else in your family be white, but if you have 1/32, you were considered African American. It never got to those extremes, but that was to the extremes that were willing to put it out. Because of that, this or that backlash in the United States, you see that according to a Public Research Bureau report from June 2005, majority of inter-ethnic Hispanic children, so they have one parent who's another race and one who's Hispanic, 63% of them are going to identify as Hispanic. Now, why is that? That's because of, as I said, this racial view where there's no gray area. They can't exercise both cultures. It's not as accepted. You're either this or that. And that's something that's really prevalent in the United States. For me, for example, I identify as I said I'm Hispanic. My dad's white. My dad's the typical American guy. We have burgers and all that. My mom's Hispanic. The reason why I actually connect with my mom's side even more is because I had her family more in my life. My dad's family's all spread out around the country. Really don't see them that much. But my grandmother, who's from Honduras, my mom, they're all there. So I would grow up, I'd go to school, I'd come home, what was my mom watching? Telemundo, Univision. And then I'd be like, oh, La Flaca y el Gordo, watching those shows. So you see, it's like that culture was in my life. Not only that, but then where would I go? I'd go visit my grandparents when they moved back to Honduras. I'd go visit them in Honduras. I'd see my family there. And I really resonated with that culture because the American culture is different. Hispanic culture, you're more tight with your family. And that's why, I know, it looks really weird. I'm very white. Look at my brother, they joke around. They're like, do you guys have the same father? Because my brother does not look like me at all. My brother looks like, he's from Honduras, and I look like I'm, visiting Honduras as a tourist. But this racial diversity adds a new element to Hispanics. So you see, majority of these children are going to identify as Hispanics. That's having an impact on the Hispanic community. So you have people in this community who aren't the typical Hispanics in that sense. They're a mix, but they identify with this culture because of what it means. And like me, that's what it did mean to me. Now, amazingly though, it's not the same. I know a lot of people, I live in Valpo, Indiana. It's a very white community. Sometimes I look at other Hispanics who aren't proud of their culture, sadly. They go to Valpo's schools, it's all white people. They don't want to admit that. Instead, they're like, oh, my dad's 5% Scottish, so I like that. They want to blend in. And it's sad that you have to choose between that. How there can't be a middle ground. And that's what we've seen in the United States. For example, look at our president, Barack Obama. He's the first African-American president. Actually, he's multiracial. But as a country, we look, you're either this or that. There can't be that mixture in there. So you're forced to choose. And it's not really fair. And that's why when I come, I feel like I offer a new insight. I see, white culture, but I resonate with Hispanic culture. So in my opinion, it's a beautiful mix that isn't expressed fully enough, but it comes in the Hispanic culture. So now, we're going to turn over to Art and Jesse, and they're going to explain a little bit more about the mixing of different people. Hello.
Hello.
So,
Alright, so my name is Jesse, and this is Arturo. Basically, I'm just going to give a bit of brief overview on how we got here. It was funny how it worked because before we were offered to present, me and Art were talking about the differences between us and our households. Him being a little more retained to the Mexican culture, and me having kind of both the Mexican influence and the American culture. So, and then literally the next day, our friend Brandon texted us about this presentation, so we thought that was our own. Alright, well, we're going to start with this graph. Obviously, it's showing 65% in the U.S. are Mexican, 9.1% are Puerto Rican, 3.6% are Salvadoran, and so on. Seeing that 65.5 is the largest. All right, so culture passed down. Usually when people come into this country, like Mexicans, they come in for the American dream and for a better life, which sometimes is the American dream. Most of the time, that is what they consider, the better life is the American dream. So through the process of just living here, we get accustomed to the culture here in America, which I identify to because I lived in the U.S. my entire life. I did like Arturo. He actually got to experience to live in Mexico for 6 months, which obviously influenced him enough to retain to that culture. And that's him, who they didn't really refuse to, live the American culture, but they stay more intact with their Mexican culture. And today, obviously, we're both prime examples of what we're telling you today. I'm more mixed with the American culture and the Mexican one, but his family's more oriented specifically with the Mexican culture. Acculturation, and this is a term that I feel like I can identify a lot, and my family can identify a lot. The process through which individuals or groups adopt to cultural features from a different group and weave them into their own cultural fabric without losing an inherent sense of identity. And I think that's what me and my siblings did, is that, we went to school and we got influenced there, and, all our friends, we grew up in the same place, an urban setting, so we, without even noticing, we adapted to this, and not really losing sight of the Mexican culture, because when we got home, the Mexican culture was there.
Right here, what is this graph is stating, like when asked, if I was to ask you guys in a big group, like what would you guys consider yourself? If I was to ask you individually, 51% of the people of the group would say, they're either from the family's country of origin, either Mexican, Colombian, Dominican, etc. And the other 24% would say they're Hispanic or Latino, which they can either, the parents could be like Mexican and they're like Jesse, he would consider himself Hispanic. If you ask me, I would consider myself Mexican from a country of origin. The other 21% consider themselves American because they practice more of the American culture. And the area that's not marked, those are just people that decide not to answer or, just to do that themselves. And it's right here saying, why is language important? Almost nearly 8 out of 10 Latinos say they speak Spanish, and about 95% say that it's important for future generations to speak it. It's important for future generations to speak it because the more familiar you are with your roots, you can, learn more about them, and if you know the language, you can sell yourself better in the market because it's rising. And unfortunately, as generations come, the language is dropped or spoken, which is sad. This graph right here just shows that Hispanics by generation, like the language, it shows how it's dropped. From first generation, which would be, an example would be like my parents, consider themselves first generation, which, my parents would be part of the Spanish dominant, which is 61% by the first generation, 33% for bilingual, 6% for English dominant, and I would be considered part of the second generation, which would be making me bilingual, which I'm part of the 53%, which me and him would be second. And by the third, it's dropped to 29%, and for the 29% for the bilingual, and the third dropped to Spanish dominant, which he has a sister, and she has a son, and he's third generation, right, Alex?
Yeah, my nephew's third generation, my sister being the second generation.
And he completely doesn't speak no Spanish at all, and his mom speaks Spanish, right?
Yeah. So that's something that obviously, the parents obviously have a lot to do with, is passing down the culture as well, and something that my sister didn't exactly remember to do, or just, maybe it's like me, for example, I think we just thought that automatically our culture is so strong, so it would just, the next generation would just transcend right into it because that's what happened to us. But, apparently my sister doesn't tell him about the customs we have, the traditions we have, so he kind of lost sight of that.
That's exactly what I said right there. It goes from 40 to 69% by the third generation, English being more dominant and higher percentage. This really just native to my culture. I feel that I'm more native to my culture than Jesse is because, I guess it's like, like a big factor. Like, you know, depending on where you live, it affects on how you practice your culture. Like, I lived in Chicago for most of my life. I mean, for 13 years, and then I moved and I lived in Mexico for 6 months. And I feel like, you know, like where you live, or like, you know, like Chicago, some schools are bilingual. So I attended our Park Elementary in Chicago. It's bilingual. Most of my teachers were bilingual. So I've always, you know, spoke Spanish, and at home I was Spanish, and at school was, you know, English with the friends. And I just feel like, you know, celebrating stuff, you know, small things, like I suppose Mexican celebrations, like I would celebrate, you know, Mother's Day on May 10th, which is like for, you know, for Hispanics, and he would celebrate May 12th, which is American. It's just, you know, little things that change, you know, the way you practice culture, and, you know, consider yourself.
And it has a lot, like you said, it has a lot to do with the influence, because when he lived in Chicago, mostly the population where he lived was all Mexican, and I lived more in a more urban diversity. And even when I got to high school, that was when I first started talking Spanish to my friends, because before that I didn't have anybody to actually talk to in Spanish and practice it in school. All right, so I'm going to do the importance of holding on to the culture is obviously being able to pass it down to the future generations. You know, understanding where you come from. When I go to a trip to Mexico, I feel, you know, like this is my roots. I feel, and I know a lot about it, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And it's sad to see somebody when they, you know, they don't know what they are. I have a friend who, you know, like Brandon was saying in his presentation, you know, she's like, I'm this percent this, this percent this, and for this percent this, but she has no culture to go back to besides the American one. And I have, and I think it's neat that I know my culture from Mexico, and I also have the culture from here in America. And passing down to future generations, and I go back to my nephew, that I guess as a family, because he lived with us, we failed to, you know, keep doing that. And it's not too late, obviously, he's still little, but up till now, you know, his parents failed to keep passing down the importance of culture. And also, like I said before, getting a sense of identity, knowing where you came from, knowing who you are, knowing where your family came from. I think that's important. You know, you keep it forever. That's something that is always going to go with you. So it's really important.
Okay, so now that we hope that we open your guys' eyes up to learning that as an ethnicity, there's a lot of racial diversity and other sorts of diversities of Hispanics. And I know we look in the mirror and we're like, oh, this is the kind of person that everyone's like. We like to assume that. But no, you look, all of us up here, we're all Hispanics. Very different. But that's just one of the great things about being Hispanic. It's such a broad coalition, and especially as Hispanics try to gain things for like the DREAM Act, you have such a broad coalition of people to work with. You know, me, you know, I'm no less interested in this. Just how Jesse and Arturo and Jaylen, all of them have an impact on this. And as Hispanics, we all have the same culture. We all feel the same thing. We all speak the same language. We all watch the same Univision and Telemundo. We're all the same. And I hope by looking at this presentation, you're able to see the diversity that encompasses Hispanics. So do you guys have any questions, any comments? Anything that shocked you? Anything that was like, you already knew really well? I do, fluently. That's something. I've been in my house, and sometimes I'll be at the mall, great example. You have those Hispanics going there, they're like, oh, they're talking, and I'm just like, oh, you can hear it. And one thing that's really cool is, if I hear a Honduran word, I'm like, oh, that person's Honduran. But it's weird because they don't look at me and they're like, oh, you know, he's Honduran. I could walk the same street as them, but they'll never know. So it's a neat thing. So, any other things?
I have a question. Within the African American community, has been some animosity between light-skinned black and the dark-skinned black. Now, listening to Arturo and Jesse, as you talked about, one statement that you made is that you felt that you were more closer to your culture or your ethnicity than he was because he was more Americanized. Yeah. Is there a certain dynamic within the Latino community that has that level of animosity for those who have assimilated to American culture more than others?
I don't think there's animosity. Sometimes, I get what you're saying, sometimes people would view it, you know, like we didn't care to continue the traditions, but I think that we just got since we're I'm the second generation. My parents were the first. They were the first. They're barely learning and adapting to everything. So I think that in the process, you're still considered like, what am I? Am I this? Am I that? Because you lived here so long, you adapt yourself to it. But I don't think there's animosity. And actually, there was in the beginning. Me and Arturo had some tension because he said that he would say comments to me that my family was white, that we have white customs, because he drinks Nescafe and I drink Starbucks. He would make those types of scenarios. But I think, and that's what we actually learned during the presentation when we were going through that. We were like, oh, so there is this difference, considering all the things that we went through in our life. Where he grew up, where I grew up. Different demographics of where each came from. And I think that sometimes it could be, a little misconstrued, but I think people just need to, do what we did and maybe do some research and find out.
And have a dialogue, it's very important.
I think I got some. Well, like, you were saying about like how light-skinned blacks and dark-skinned blacks have, I don't know, the animosity between them. Like, when I go to Mexico, when I went before, I haven't been in like 3 years, but I was born here, I was born in Chicago, and when I go to Mexico, and I hang out with like people over there, like I make friends over there, they call me a gringo, because I was born over here, even though I'm Mexican, like I'm Mexican here, when I go over there, I'm a gringo, so I mean, that's kind of like, it's not like haters.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because when I go to Mexico, they tell me the same thing, and I haven't also, I have to admit, in 3 years or so on, but I think one time I was like, we were outside and a mosquito bit me, so I was like, oh, a mosquito bit me, and I didn't know how to say it in Spanish, so I said mosquito, and they started laughing at me, and they were calling me the same thing, they were like, gringo, and I'm like, what is it called? And I got it was mosco, which I just, I thought it was the same thing, mosquito in Spanish, it sounds the same. But it's just terms that we use here that, when we go over there, we don't even notice how Americanized we did become.
And I feel like when you're in Mexico, you're a gringo.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're here, you're a Mexican. Yeah. So like I don't know, I find that kind of funny,
Yeah.
But it's like, I guess my question is like, how would you yourself identify? Like, what would you identify yourself really? Like Hispanic? Like, would you just consider yourself Hispanic?
Well, what he was saying, I think I'm a mixture of both. Because I was born and raised here, but my parents are from over there, and I consider myself Mexican. So I think that we just like, it's a beautiful thing because America is that melting pot of mixing cultures, and that's we're all proof of that.
Right. Yeah. Because sometimes I feel like culturally, like we're not accepted by either. Both.
Mm-hmm.
Like
when you're separate, right? When you're over there, and when you're over here, you're I get what you're saying.
I have a question for you. All right, so how you guys were talking about that? Well, what happens when somebody, and I know we talked about it in the conference, what happens when somebody is born in Mexico, brought here at a young age, so then what are they? Going back to your question, embrace your American ways.
My mom was born here, taken to Mexico and raised in Mexico, and she was brought back. But if you ask her, I don't know how to say it, but because that was the same thing with my uncle. My uncle is like, I don't know, ever since he got his citizenship test and passed it, he considers himself American. Like, if you ask him, what are you? He's like, I'm American. I got my license, like everything, passport. But when I was born, if you ask her, she says she's Mexican, even though she was born here. So I think like, if you were born there and brought here, I still think it's depending on where you live and how you're raised. That's how you would consider yourself.
And that's something when you look at Hispanic, you do see everyone has their own unique story. And the way people identify themselves, it shocks. You'd be like, oh, I'm Mexican, I was born and raised there. And then like you have someone who equally raised there, has the same feel, but someone might not view her that way. They're like, oh, she's American, she was born in the United States. It's not as simple as saying, this is the definition. And that's why when you look at Hispanic, that diversity is encompassed in it.
You want a question?
Also, she would be Hispanic American.
Should we what?
She would be Hispanic American. Just answer the question.
You said that your nephew that you failed to pass down the Hispanic custom. How old's your nephew?
Well, he's your nephew too, so I would hope you knew.
I don't know how old he is. Okay, you said that you failed to pass down the Hispanic culture. Now
The
that
Mexican culture.
the Mexican culture, now that you presented this, I mean, you obviously did a lot of research. Do you think you're going to try harder to pass it down to him?
Yeah, it's just hard because his dad was born here and his family doesn't have they didn't hold on to the Mexican culture at all. So when he and my sister and his dad aren't together anymore. So when he goes to that household, all they speak is English. And he doesn't, he can't communicate with his grandparents or with his dad in Spanish. And so when he comes to our house, now he's just confused and he can barely speak Spanish, or understand it at all.
Does your mom talk Spanish to him?
Yeah, my mom will try to speak Spanish to him, and all he knows is how to say "gay." So that means what? But yeah, it is hard, and I do, sometimes it's hard to go back, and try to teach him that because now I'm sitting there speaking to him in Spanish, and he's just staring at me because he doesn't know anything at all. And that's something that we all have to, and I say we all have to do it because he lives with all of us. He doesn't only depend on his mom and dad, he depends on all of us first. And you too, because you're his own.
One thing, just for me, I didn't learn Spanish in my house, actually. What happened was my parents were, typical American. My mom was, English. That's the language of the United States. That's what she was, and when it came to me, I actually learned it in school. And what I do is I go to Honduras and I practice and I practice. I speak like a caveman using what I know. And then as time went on, I wanted to learn about that culture because it's a complete side of my family that really, it was there, but it wasn't taught to me in the sense of the language. So I'd go to Honduras and I'd learn that way, just to show how even if culture is not passed down in that sense, different immigrants deal with it differently. Some pass it down. Others, they want to assimilate. Like, that's how my family was. Like, we're American now. And, they did that. So you see, there's different ways of culture being passed down, and it's just the different scenarios and different things that Hispanics will play out to feel it's best suited for them. Because I bet like all of you guys have different stories in terms of how your families come here. The stuff your families did isn't the same. Every person who's come here has a different story.
Adding on to what he was saying, my mom was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and then she, I guess Puerto Rico is a territory in the U.S., so it's still American, but Hispanic American. But when she came over for college actually, and she was actually part of the assimilation into the American society. So when she met my dad, he's full African American, and me being in the area, because I live in Gary, Indiana, so predominantly black. It's really like it's probably like 75% black, 25% Hispanic. So really, I don't really know too much Spanish. I know like something, but I can't really.
He knows
talk.
gay as well.
Yeah, I don't get. Well, no, but I know C. But as far as like what I was watching, I know he was watching Telemundo. I was watching SpongeBob.
More question?
I got a question for Art. You said that you relate more to the American culture and you more to the Mexican culture because you said you lived there for 6 months. But before you lived there for 6 months, like when you first got there, did you consider yourself American now living in Mexico, or like this is where you...
I mean, I just like when I was raised, my first language was Spanish at the house, and my mom's always like, like when I'm speaking English at the house with my sister, she's like, "Are you talking about me?" I'm like, "No way." I'm like, "Well, I'm not talking about you." It's like, "Okay." It's like, "Well, Spanish is the house, and English is with my friends." So I've always considered myself Mexican. I mean, like I say, like my dad's like, "Oh, no, tomorrow's Mother's Day, make time for it." I thought it was a 12. No, it's big time. Ever since I was little, so it's always just been raised to those Mexican celebration days, May 5th. I don't remember when the Mexican Independence Day, September 16th, or something like that. I don't know what it is. I've always considered myself Mexican, regardless, even before I moved up there.
I think it's as I was saying, I think it's important for our generation, the second generation, I thought what Brandon did, and he actually went to go learn it because he didn't get that. But I think we have to practice that on our own too, because throughout my day, I'm speaking English all day. And by the time I get to home to my parents, like, I struggle a lot trying to speak in Spanish now because I have to change it. And it's, you know, if I don't practice it, then that's something that, you know, can go away as easily as I learned it. And I think, I mean, I don't know how it is for anybody in here who speaks Spanish to their parents, and then all day you're just, you know, around speaking English, and I get confused and my words get confused and I don't know how to pronounce something. Even sometimes I make up an English word with a Mexican word. Spanglish, there you go, I'll make a Spanglish word up.
I even get confused, like when I'm at school, you know, taking tests or something like that. I don't know why, but for some reason I always keep on thinking of the Spanish language of the things. You know, it's kind of hard for me, you know, speaking both languages, trying to concentrate on one language sometimes. Because I'm always like, mostly, like, I don't know, I'm at home, but you know, when I go hang out with friends, stuff like that, it's always English. But I don't know, I guess I'm just more used to the Spanish language. That's why it's hard for me.
Just curious, I want to know something. Who here who speaks Spanish in here? Fluent Spanish. Okay. And when you have your children, depending on what generation that is, you guys saw the statistics up there. Your child has, out of all the kids that are going to be there, if there are 100 kids, if your child is third generation, only 30 of those 100 kids are actually going to speak Spanish. If you go to second generation, it's a little bit greater. But you see, as we have more and more generations in America, a lot of Hispanic children aren't learning Spanish. 95% want their children to speak it, but not a lot do. Does that scare you guys? I know when when we were looking at the statistics, Jesse told me, he's like, I want my child to speak Spanish, and he looked at it, he's like, wow. And then, you know, your nephew came up.
Yeah.
So how do you guys feel about that? You guys want your children to speak Spanish, right?
They make more money.
So, is that statistic with the whole the Hispanics marrying outside their ethnicity, is that still today?
That
They said
is.
it was like, so they said it was like 1980 or something.
It was from 1980 to 2010 and on. The trend has been for every 4 newlywed Hispanics, one of them, so 25% marries out. So you see, there's a lot of that out marrying. That's what they call it in the Hispanic community. People are out marrying. They bring in new cultures and a new mix. So yeah, so that's a lot. Any more?
Comments?
Good.
Thank you guys very much.